Welcome to this online lecture for Europe since 1848. This is actually the lecture that, or at least a portion of this lecture, is what I delivered in class on Wednesday. But given that this is a preparation for the upcoming exam, I thought I would just post it online so that you actually have a chance to see the entire lecture and then perhaps review some of the ideas that we covered in class on Wednesday. So, anyway, let's get to it. We have covered a number of isms in our first unit this semester. Really, the 19th century was the century of isms. We've talked about liberalism, we've talked about conservatism, we've talked about socialism, nationalism, and even anti-Semitism. Since the Congress of Vienna, conservatism has been the dominant ism governing Europe in the 19th century. However, events throughout the century will arise to challenge conservative rule across Europe. The Industrial Revolution, for example, led to the development of a middle class. The middle class does not enjoy the privileges of nobility, yet they do contribute much to the wealth of the nation. Thus, many of the individuals, many of the members of the middle class began to demand a greater say in government than conservatives were willing to give to them. They wanted voting rights, they wanted a reduction in the power of the nobility, and they wanted less government involvement in the economy. One of the philosophers leading the charge for liberalism was John Stuart Mill. Remember, we read a portion of his essay on liberty. And again, it's a lot about limiting the powers of government, or limiting the influence of government over people's lives. The ideas of natural rights, representative government, constitutions, these were things that John Stuart Mill could get behind. But liberalism also had an economic side as well. Adam Smith, in his book The Wealth of Nations, argued in favor of a laissez-faire approach to the economy as far as the government was concerned. In other words, governments should not intervene in the economy. That if left to itself, an economy would actually function best for all people. That if left alone, the economy would produce the most wealth. And that this is the idea that really many liberals will grab onto as well, because again, it calls for limiting the power of government. At the same time the Industrial Revolution is creating a middle class, it's also creating a crisis for the working class. Many members of the working class are forced to work long hours under brutal conditions. Moreover, the new industrial economy will hire workers in good times and fire them in bad. This creates a precarious situation for many workers. Socialism will arise to deal with these problems. But socialists don't always agree on the proper solution. Moderate socialists, like Louis Blanc here, advocate for greater government intervention in the economy to assist workers in bad times. The intervention could take the form of laws advocating shorter working hours, better working conditions, and job training in tough times. These were the workshops that we've discussed in class thus far. On the other end of the socialist spectrum, you had radical socialists like Karl Marx. So what do radical socialists advocate? Revolution. In fact, they believe that revolution is inevitable. As conditions continue to deteriorate, workers will one day rise up and seize power for themselves. By the year 1900, however, no working class revolution had materialized. So why? Why didn't the working class rise up and seize power as Marx had predicted? Well, the reality is that neither Marx nor Blanc saw how socialism actually could be used as a tool by other movements, by some of the other isms. In Germany, for example, Bismarck's very conservative government will push through some very socialist reforms to help soften the blow of capitalism. For example, there was the Sickness Insurance Law of 1883, which granted workers insurance should they become sick or injured and unable to work. Later on, Germany will also create a socialized insurance program, in other words, a state-run insurance program. Basically, by being a citizen of Germany, you have health insurance. Now, this is far in excess of what Obamacare does today, and yet Germany was doing this more than a century ago. Moreover, German workers are receiving retirement pensions during this period as well. It's going to take until the 1930s and the Great Depression for the United States to establish Social Security. So what we're seeing here is that conservatism is actually using socialism to keep the workers happy, to prevent revolution from breaking out. But conservatives weren't the only ones to see the benefits in some socialist reforms. Liberals in Great Britain, for example, pushed through the Factory Act in 1875, which set a work week of 56 hours. Seems very long to us, but for them, this is actually an improvement. They also tried to ensure that the apartments where workers lived, the buildings where workers were living, were actually safe and healthy places to live. Finally, by 1900, they're granting their workers workman's compensation. Should they become injured on the job, they should be paid for this to help them get through this very difficult period of their lives. So again, here, liberals are now using socialism in order to prop up their power, to keep their regimes strong. Another force shaping Europe at this time was nationalism. Now, the classical view of nationalism was a belief that people who shared a common language and culture should also share a common government. It was this dream that drove men like Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who observed the ravages in Napoleon's countless invasions of German territory in the early 1800s. Fichte's version of nationalism is really owes a lot to liberalism. That's because this version, this liberal nationalism, does not involve national pride or the use of force. Instead, it's more like liberalism, a belief that people should govern themselves. What Fichte is saying here is people who have a common language and a common culture should govern themselves. Of course, we've discovered that liberalism wasn't the only influence over nationalism. Otto von Bismarck demonstrated that conservatism could also drive nationalism. Bismarck, as we said earlier, was an ultra-conservative. In his Blood and Iron speech, he made it clear that he planned to ignore Prussia's legislature in favor of its army. In fact, he used that army to neutralize Austria and France, two opponents of German unification. So here we have conservatives using nationalism in Germany. So, what does that mean for Europe in 1900? In many ways, Europe is a very modern place by 1900. Most of the continent is industrialized or industrializing. The hazards of industrialization are also being softened by elements of socialism that have been worked into conservative or liberal governments. At the same time, many of Europe's ethnic groups have created unified nations. This has happened in Germany and it's happened in Italy. Still, there are problems that remain. And that's what we're going to cover in the next unit.